Hey Pallerinos, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series on my channel where we just discuss the history of the European Reformation. Today I want to talk to you guys about the Anabaptist movement and why it was viewed as an extremist group in 16th century Europe. So onwards to chapter 1. The Zwickau Prophets. Now, as you guys already know, Martin Luther spent quite a lot of time in Wartburg Castle for several years to make sure he didn't get a little bit murdered. Whilst he was absent, the Wittenberg Reformation was primarily led by a guy called Andreas Karlstadt. He had slightly more extreme views than Luther. Now, the Zwickau Prophets believed in a few things. Primarily, they did not believe in the Eucharist, and they believed in adult baptism. Luther's return kind of ended this movement. But now I want to talk to you about a specific one of the prophets called Thomas Munster. Now, he was born in central Germany and trained for the priesthood. He was fluent in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, and in his younger years he was a disciple of Luther. In 1520 he was a priest in Zwickau in Saxony, and that's when he converted to Anabaptism, or adult baptism. In this time he started to criticise Luther. Here are a few of the fun names he called Luther. Dr. Liar, Father Pussyfoot, which is my favourite, sorry. The Wittenberg Pope. He then joined the Peasants' War and was ultimately executed in 1525. He believed that the world was ending and the second coming of Christ was on its way. And that kind of ties in with everything we're going to talk about next. So, chapter 2. The Anabaptists. Now, I feel the need to point out that Anabaptist was a term that they didn't use to describe themselves. It was an insult from the rest of society. These people would never refer to themselves as this. Now, there were a few flaws with the Anabaptist movement. They had no unity, they had no leadership, they were very fragmented groups. But fundamentally, they all believed in adult baptism. Now, part of why this was seen as so dreadful and terrifying in the 16th century was that people didn't live that long. Infant mortality was through the roof. And even if you survived infancy, there was no guarantee you'd survive to adulthood, so realistically they viewed this as risking people's souls. They also had kind of what we'd now call communist beliefs. More on that in a minute. 1530, a man named Hoffmann asked Strasbourg to give the Anabaptists their own church. He was ordered to be arrested, so he fled to the Netherlands. This time the Netherlands were under the control of Charles V of Spain. But there he began a mass movement. His ideas were very popular. The Second Coming was kind of supported in people's minds by events that had been going on. So there had been 3 comets, there had been famine, plague, there had been floods, and this is the 16th century. And people don't necessarily see this as anything other than an act of God. Now, there wasn't really a structure or organisation to this new reform, not like there had been with Lutheranism, and certainly not like there was with Calvinism. Another of Hoffmann's very popular ideas was social justice for the poor. Food prices were high, people were losing employment, there was no support system for the poor at this time, and they had basically no power. Hoffmann later returned to Strasbourg as a result of a prophecy. I shit you not, there was a prophecy that he'd be imprisoned for 6 months, and then his teachings would spread worldwide. He died in prison in 1543. Shocker. Now, because Charles of Spain was ruling over the Netherlands and the Spanish were strictly Catholic, the persecution of this group was really ramped up. Some sought safe havens in places like Munster. More on Munster in a moment. Some stayed behind and tried to create a rebellion. This generally just led to further persecution, and they suffered greatly and a lot of people were executed. They also believed in separatism, so this was the idea to stay separate from what they viewed to be sinners. Property was redistributed for communal use, which kind of gave the peasants some power, which also added to why people were drawn to this idea, but also why it was viewed as so extreme. They also didn't believe in imperial law, so some of the people in the Netherlands supported the Turks in the war with Spain. Chapter 3. Munster. Before I tell you about Munster itself, I want to tell you about the Schleitheim Articles. This was essentially a series of rules that laid out what Anabaptists believe. I'm just going to point out 3 of what I think are the most important ones. So, Article 1, the Pope is evil, the Pope is bad, the Pope does not represent God. Article 4, you should separate yourself from sinful people and live separately to them. Article 5, all opposition must be stopped and punished. So, in February of 1534, the Anabaptists seized the city of Munster. A lot of Anabaptists who were being persecuted, as I mentioned, fled to this seemingly safe haven. A lot of people saw this success as a sign the last days were well on their way. The bishop fled the city and, after having to do so, received support from Lutheran and Catholic leaders. This was seen as such a danger that the two actually would work together to try and stop it. Soon, Jan Bulls, soon to be known as John of Leyden, took control of the city. He developed a regime with essentially 2 aims: usher in the last days, which he gave a date for, more on that in a minute, and sustain the urgent needs of a crowded city. Property was forcibly redistributed, but city nobles were exempt from this, so not really a communist dream, is it? There was a council of elders, polygamy was instated because there were more women than men present, and it was designed to protect the women and give them security. In the summer, the bishop closed all of the exits to the city and essentially tried to starve them out. John then proclaimed himself the messianic king of the world. He was the new David of Israel, and he minted symbolic coins. People were hungry and miserable and kind of angry because the date that they'd said the last days would happen had passed and nothing had happened, and he'd been like, oh no, whoopsie, we'll be later, and people were starting to be a bit uncertain about this life. In 1535, the bishop's forces, supported in part by Lutheran forces, were led through the defences by 2 of the city's turncoats, which ended 17 months of what some people have described as a social experiment. Thanks, Cole Sprouse. Was it Cole? I think it was Cole. Jan of Hus and his 2 main supporters were publicly executed. This was a huge spectacle and was clearly meant to make a point. Giant pincers were heated and essentially tore them apart, and their corpses were displayed in iron cages from the church. The cages still hang there, the corpses don't. Now, another key belief of the Anabaptists was that iconoclasm, or sort of having visual representations of God, was bad, so they'd had iconoclastic riots where they tore everything down. They did this so well that there is no evidence of the Catholic Church in Munster pre-1534. I'd also like to add that most radicals were disgusted by the violence and disillusionment known at Munster. People still listened and people still contemplated on these ideas, but mainly they went underground. To chapter 4. What about now? Well, Anabaptists kind of still exist. We obviously don't call them that anymore. Here are a few groups that essentially come from that basis: Mennonites, Hutterites, and the Amish. Their influence can be recognised in a few ways. One of those is voluntary church baptism and believers' baptism. So this means you have the choice. You aren't forced to be baptised the second you're born and you don't get a say in it. You decide that you want to be baptised. Freedom of religion, you can believe this and other people can believe what they like, but you believe this. Separatism, so starting their own communities completely detached from the rest of the world. Nonconformity and pacifism, which wasn't really shown at Munster but was a core belief. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, give me a cheeky like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you'd like me to talk about next season, because this season ends next week. We've got one final episode for you. I've got one final episode for you. I don't have a team yet. And yeah, I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!